U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century has involved brutal intervention, both covert and otherwise, in Muslim-majority nations in the Middle East and North Africa. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, all countries who defied U.S. economic interests and were met with the full force of the American empire. This includes a massive fear campaign against radical Islamic terrorism, trying to convince Americans to wage a war on terror, a war not against an enemy, but a concept, which has been used to justify the destruction of any Muslim nation in the 21st century who attempt to utilize their own resources for development rather than the enrichment of Western multinational corporations. The so-called war on terror began after the September 11th terrorist attacks, which was used as justification for the invasion of Iraq despite the fact that most of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. The war on terror is nothing more than a ploy for the U.S. empire to lie us into new wars. Anti-Islamic sentiment and xenophobia has played a huge role in 20th and 21st century imperialism. 30% of GOP voters and 19% of Democrats say they support bombing Agrabah. Agrabah is the fictional city from Aladdin. Americans have been trained to fear and hate anything that sounds Islamic, or Arabic, or just Middle Eastern. People think because our tech companies and media companies are privately owned, they're not training us to think a certain way. But they are. Let's just do a quick Google search of the word terrorist. Tell me what kind of people you see. Is it white people? Is it the Ku Klux Klan, right-wing terrorists? No, it's Middle Eastern people, and the Libyan president Muammar Gaddafi, who the U.S. overthrew, and now there's a slave trade in Libya. And you got Hamas in there too, of course. The whole war on terror is a sham. It's just meant to make Americans scared of Muslims. The U.S. doesn't actually care about terrorism. They funded Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen because the Mujahideen were fighting the Soviet Union at the time. The U.S. only cares about their own geopolitical interests. So if you hate Muslims, stop. You're being a sheep. Got this comment saying that xenophobia towards Muslim people in America was worse a while back because of San Bernardino. And man, if our whole country hates Muslim people because of a shooting that killed 14 people, I wonder how Muslim people feel about the Iraq War, where the U.S. invaded a country who never attacked us, killing hundreds of thousands of people. Or the U.S. occupying Afghanistan for 19 years for vast mineral riches. Or the U.S. funded Israeli occupation of Palestine that has made it so 75% of Palestinian people are now refugees. Or the U.S. funded proxy war in Syria that destroyed the country. Or the sanctions that we're putting on Syria as they try and rebuild their country. Or the military intervention in Libya to overthrow Gaddafi that would lead to Libya now having an open slave trade. Yeah, I mean, if people from the U.S. hate Muslims because of San Bernardino, can't imagine how Muslims feel about the U.S. I mean, if San Bernardino really made things worse, it's because every time there's a shooting, Fox News does a month of nonstop coverage on radical Islamic terrorism. But you know, there might be less Islamic groups who want to destroy America if we stop destroying all the Islamic countries. Just a thought, I don't know, maybe I'm crazy. So while we in the States have been celebrating Christmas, Israel was launching missiles at Palestinians in Gaza. Missiles which the U.S. pays $3.8 billion a year to maintain. Everyone needs to go follow Pala Marks, like Palestine Mark. She's an actual Palestinian person, so her knowledge on this is invaluable. Most of the news on this right now is in Arabic, and there's no way the U.S. mainstream media is going to pick this up. This is insanity. We just agreed to send Israel another $500 million. While Americans are only getting $600 checks for COVID relief. This is where your money's going. To death and to destruction. No race runs the world, money does. That's exactly right. Anti-Semites are bigots and they're misinterpreting the Israel-Palestine conflict. As my buddy the Hebrew Hammer and Sickle was showing me earlier, there are lots of poor and working class Jewish people who are also oppressed by the right-wing Israeli government. And people are always talking about Hamas. Israel needs to keep firing missiles at Gaza so they can get Hamas. But right-wingers in the Israeli government created Hamas. When Israel occupied Gaza, the leading Palestinian political party was the left-wing secular PLO, led by Palestinian nationalist Yasser Arafat. In a tactic to divide and conquer, Israel started funding Sheikh Yassin and the Muslim Brotherhood, which would later become Hamas. And Israel would kill him with a missile. The situation going on in Israel right now is not happening because Jews are bad. You're a racist and you're an idiot. It's happening because right-wing capitalist imperialists want to expand. And if that means they have to fund right-wing extremist groups, they will do it. Similarly, the U.S. is only funding Israel for economic reasons. I cannot believe people in the U.S. really want to overthrow Iran's government again. That's right, again. Iran had a democratically elected leader named Mohammad Mossadegh come to power in 1950, and he nationalized Iran's oil. You know who that oil belonged to before he nationalized it? The UK. And the UK was super mad that Iran would want to use their own resources on themselves. How selfish of those Iranians, trying to take from the white colonizers. So the UK hit up the US, and the US is like, we got you guys. And the CIA overthrew Mossadegh and put in the Shah, until religious Iranians and leftist Iranians said screw this. And in '79 they had a revolution which established the current Islamic Republic. Since this time, Iran's economy has been centrally planned, and much of the major industries are publicly owned. So while a lot of Iranians would like their country to go further left, if the US could overthrow the government, our multinationals would have access to tons of new resources in Iran, with all those publicly owned industries. Which is exactly why those in power want to overthrow Iran's government. Again. Can we tell them no this time, please? Want to know why I don't care when people call me a dictator defender for saying the US shouldn't invade Iran? I don't care because that's the same thing people said to those in the early 2000s who said the US shouldn't invade Iraq. That Saddam Hussein didn't actually have weapons of mass destruction and Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. You were a dictator defender, a supporter of Saddam Hussein. Don't you care about Iraqi lives? Now the war in Iraq's killed hundreds of thousands. It's being called the worst crime of the century, and we know for a fact Saddam didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Same thing with Libya. Hey, the US shouldn't invade Libya. Oh, you support Gaddafi, you hate women, how do you call yourself a leftist? You dictator defender. That's what everyone said in 2011. The US overthrew Gaddafi, left Libya with no government, and now they have an open-air slave trade. So I'm not falling for this. No, I don't support the Iranian theocracy. Yeah, I wish they could be more secular, but that's up to the Iranians. America, the United States, should have no say in what happens in Iran. And I'm going to continue saying that before this country lies us into another disastrous war. Sorry if that makes me a dictator defender. Iran recently built a super dope supermarket in Venezuela. This is one of many examples of Iran and Venezuela collaborating to try and keep people fed, as the US is putting crippling sanctions on both countries even during the pandemic. This comes at a time when the NGO UN Watch is reporting that Venezuela and Iran are the most dangerous countries in the world. Yeah, I don't know about that one, you guys. I'm pretty sure the country trying to starve out other countries in the middle of a global pandemic are the real bad guys here. USA! USA! Okay, the Iran deal. This is definitely worth talking about. The Iran deal was probably the best thing the Obama administration actually did. It was a deal struck in 2015 between Iran and the UN. The deal put limits on the Iranian nuclear program. It made it so they're not allowed to make a nuclear weapon, and they can't enrich uranium up to a certain point. The deal also made it so Iran's nuclear program is monitored 24/7 by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And not once since that monitoring started has Iran been accused of making a nuclear weapon. Also, the US had to decrease sanctions on Iran as part of the deal. But President Hamburglar pulled us out, saying that the deal was a sham because it paid Iran money. But the money paid to Iran was money that the US stole from Iran in 1979. Because after the US overthrew Iran's democratically elected leader in '53, we started selling huge amounts of weapons to the Western-backed Shah. And then after the 1979 revolution, which overthrew the Shah, the US stopped sending weapons, including $400 million of weapons that were already paid for. Now you know.